Don Spence, board certified master arborist with a PhD, so he's a doctor. I guess we just call him Dr. Spence then. This is Don Spence, we should be doctor. In plant pathology from the University of Florida, so he spent most of his life in Florida, which many of us did, actually, even if we weren't from there originally. Written several articles related to invasive species, tree selection, and the importance of using native plants in urban landscapes. And a lot of that applies even if it's not quite so urban as it is up here, but still relevant. Was with the Florida Native Plant Society, which we were as well. Member of the East Central Florida Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So this whole idea of trying to figure out what's invasive, what's not, and how do you get rid of it is a huge ongoing issue, absolutely. 7 years in the Coast Guard, so thank you for that. And now lives in Young Harris. So very much appreciated. Title of his talk, Forest Pathogens and Tree Species Diversity. Thank you very much.
It's a pleasure to be here. I can't even express how happy I am to be able to talk to the Georgia Native Plant Society. I was part of the Florida Native Plant Society for 25 years and was very involved at the state level in lots of ways.
Is this okay having the leg off, or is that?
Yeah, that's
I think the Native Plant Society movement is a wonderful thing. I studied, I've always been interested in vegetation and started doing seagrass surveys and people started, I was good at taxonomy and plant anatomy. People started asking about trees, and so then I started focusing on trees and went back late in life to earn my doctorate degree in plant pathology, and I specialized in tree diseases. So my talk will be, first, it's disease and some diversity. So I'm going to start talking a little bit about tree diversity first, then we'll talk about 12 or 13 just overview of some tree diseases, and then we'll finish up talking about some more diversity. The struggle with let's see here. That's always one thing. I can probably move it forward. There we go. How about that? All right. So disease is a biotic thing. It can be viruses, bacteria, or can be human mitigated problems, whether directly or indirectly. And this is a plant called the Florida yew. It's an incredibly rare, small tree. It used to be a fairly good sized tree, but under pressure from bacteria and more than that, fungi, it's a threatened species. It's in a critical place of whether it may go extinct or not. So all organisms fight disease, and we are no different. And plants have attacks from viruses, bacteria, fungi, insects. Mycoplasms are this kind of in-between group. They're a little fungal-like, little bacteria-like, but they're their own group. But there are invasive species that put pressure on native plant systems, especially small, rare things that need open space. This is old world climbing fern in South Florida. Incredibly, I mean, it's impossible to grow. It covers everything. It's a fern, and it's like kudzu. And so it is such a hard thing for plant systems and plant communities to deal with that we really have to get involved. But it got here because of us. Then there's the whole us aspect, the putting pressure on trees. And whether it's for clearing land for food or buildings for commercial endeavors, vegetation suffers. And so we need to work at promoting tree preservation during construction, recognizing that agriculture has to remove trees, but we need to be putting trees back in as well. Is this the way it's been? And our country was founded on, really, by and large, the exploitation of wood. From the earliest times, the Mayflower came over, and one of their charges were to send fur back to England, but also trees. England had been devoid of trees for a long time. And so the people coming to colonize the New World, the goal was to send large trees back because they didn't have any. And so we have, really essentially denuded the landscape. The few areas that are old growth are pine, basically, mountain areas, redwoods and sequoias, but we haven't done a good job of preserving trees. And this is the forest cover. So we don't expect the entire globe to be covered with trees, but there are regions where trees do really well. And here we're looking at the change in tree cover over time. And so there are places where the bars are going up, that's a net increase, but that's really small. 0.2% increase in forest cover isn't a lot. But, on the same token, we're seeing only 0.6 of loss. We are on a steadily constant decline of forest cover. And we need to change it. Trees are not going to solve our climate change, our carbon in the atmosphere. They're not the solution, but they are a big part of the solution. And when we look at where the trees are globally, there are regions where there are more trees than others. And at the end of this talk, I'm going to talk about a paper that was done last year about global tree diversity, and I'll have some summary information about that. And so, the entire planet isn't vegetated equally, and there are places where there are more trees than others. This is an image that shows where tree research is currently ongoing. And this is almost all tied to climate change in trees, and what does it happen? What's the pressure from climate change, change in weather patterns, rainfall, heat, doing to trees, but it's also about pathogens as well. So these are just places where papers have been recently published related to tree disease. It's happening all over the planet. It's not just us. It's a massive global problem. Climate change is huge, but it's also our fault for moving wood products around the planet at alarming rates. So when we bring in massive amounts of vegetation, potting soil, trees, shrubs, we move landscapes material around the world, and of course not only products, we have caused a lot of problems due to in bringing insects in. And so insects arriving, not being native to this continent, are taking, they grow out of proportion and then destroy forest systems. And our forests today are different from what they were 200 years ago, all because of humans importing trees and tree products. The purple line is where we want to focus here. That's the change in invasive species or problem pathogen detections in Florida. And we're all old enough to remember Ross Perot in one of his debates in '92 saying, if you pass NAFTA, all the jobs are going to go to Mexico. Basically what he said. Well, that was true, but it also meant that global trade was then kicking off, and we were moving things around the planet at alarming rates. And from that point, it's gone, not exponential, but it's a steep curve of new introductions every year. And it's in Florida, these gentlemen who work for, I think they've retired, but the Florida Department of Consumer Services, FDACS, did a study that they're estimating $120 billion a year in damage due to just Florida's economy. And it's probably an underestimate. And this goes to, there's loss of agricultural productivity. There are scales on avocados. There are diseases that affect citrus. And so the massive amount of money that's lost through agriculture due to non-native pests is massive. In Miami, where the port of entry is for so many things, they get Mediterranean fruit fly outbreaks all the time. And they dump millions and millions and millions a year to go down and try to eradicate the fruit fly. And then just recently they've had giant snail outbreaks that are eating the paint off people's homes and damaging vegetation. And they send armies of people to South Florida to eradicate and kill snails. And these all come in because of humans. Because if you travel abroad, you have to fill out a little custom sheet saying, are you bringing in anything that's, a viable plant product? And people, usually don't acknowledge what they're bringing in. And that's part of our problem. So don't bring things in when you come back from overseas. You just never know. These are the major orders of insects that have caused problems in Florida. So there are 12 there, but I studied a lot of beetles, and so the Coleoptera, the beetle group, they're constantly a problem. And so this just points out that not all insects, again, are attacking plants equally. It's the lepidopterans they were a problem, probably moths mostly. We've got the true bug group right here that are problems, and then of course the beetles. And these all chew on plants in one way or another, and sometimes the insects themselves are carriers of fungi or viruses that attack something else. So we'll get to the disease I studied, and it's a beetle that attacks a tree, but it's not the beetle that's killing the tree, it's the fungus that lives inside the beetle in symbiosis that does the tree. So it's a crazy complicated thing. In Florida, around 2010 or so, 2009, they passed a law, state law, banning the movement of wood, non-treated wood products more than 50 miles. So you can't, you shouldn't be taking firewood around. So the message is, don't take firewood when you're going camping. Buy it locally, unless you're going, short distances. But the movement of wood products is another big problem, and how we'll see the spread of these diseases across the country almost always tied to people moving firewood. So don't move firewood. This is a list of diseases that have been identified over the past 100+ years. All of these have been brought in by humans in one way or the other. Certainly all non-intentional. Nobody's deciding to bring in something that's diseased. And prior to the mid part of this century, last century, nobody really knew what to look for when it came to diseases. Although there's a Plant Quarantine Act that was started in 1912, it's really hard to pin down what disease is and what it's on if you're not spending money on studying it. We don't have a good mechanism to do that. Now, the USDA does a really good job with what they've got for trying to intercept invasive species and diseases before they get to the country, but they look at such a small percentage of shipping material and items that, a lot gets through without it. So trees are dealing with all these invasive problems, but they're also dealing with native problems. This is armillaria, common tree in the landscape, common fungus in the landscape that affects trees. And it's a killer. It eventually will wear down and kill a tree. The one on the left, chicken of the forest, it's not really a true pathogen, but it degrades trees slowly. It mostly is living on the dead wood within a tree. But eventually it will overcome the problem and take over the tree. This actually parasitizes healthy living wood, and once a fungus gets into a tree, it's really essentially impossible to get it out. Then things like this on the bark of trees. This is an oak tree. It's completely superficial, has no real bearing on the health of the tree. And so you just leave them there because they're not going to be causing decline in the health of the tree. When it comes to wood products, pine especially, this is a disease that gets into slash pine and loblolly pine, and it girdles them. It's a rust fungus. It's got a really strange life cycle, but it degrades the quality of the crop. And therefore, the people that are growing the trees don't have a good product. We have wood issues. We don't have good wood to sell as part of the market of the building industry or pulpwood. So it's a serious problem. And so all of these things are issues for us economically. They're issues for the plants. But sometimes you have to recognize that problematic things we may see as a problem for a tree, it's actually kind of good for the environment. And so this is tent caterpillar, and it's unsightly and it degrades the tree. They eat the leaves. It just looks terrible. But now what do we have? Lots of food for birds. And the birds are so dependent upon caterpillars and bats. Bats are a big part of the forest ecosystems. So things like this, people, hire me to look at the tree and what's wrong. Can we get rid of the caterpillars? Like, you shouldn't. It's such an important resource. Tolerate it. It's not going to kill the tree. It's part of the forest system. And so it takes education, it takes knowledge, it takes asking people, well, what do I have and what is the repercussion if I don't do something or if I do, do something about it. So it's a complicated endeavor to understand why trees are not doing well or how to manage them. And in cases where trees like this, this tree has to come out. It's just the way it is. I've seen plenty of trees that are in situations like this that look great. You're like, how is that tree doing so well when it's got construction all around it? But it really almost always comes down to the health of the roots. How are the roots doing? And these pine trees by and large don't do well with development around them and any level of development. So this tree has to come out. Whether it declined early on and was just pushed over the edge, or whether the development did it, or whether driving over the tree roots did it. This tree is being attacked by insects now. And it's no longer in a viable state, and it's become a hazard and has to come out. The whole dynamic of pines and pine insects, pine bark beetles is a big deal. And did I go too far there? Oh, I think I took out the slide. That's okay. I was, of course, editing at the last minute. And so there are lots and lots of insect problems that cause these problems, and pine bark beetles are something that, they're native, they're part of the system, they're being fed on by insects and birds and other things. So they are only a problem when they kind of get out of control and they have these massive breeding events when there are lots of sick trees or they're under stress and cause these problems. And I've got a little slide about pine bark beetles later on as well. So when we talk about disease, here are about 50 diseases that are not uncommon. These are things that are affecting trees and vegetation as a whole across the country every day. These are things that they're there. Most of them are native, some of them are introduced, but this is what trees and forest systems deal with. And when it's a forest system, it may not be a problem. We don't want episodic massive outbreaks of disease in a forest, but then again, a dead tree is part of the ecosystem of the system itself. But in an urban setting, probably not so good. So if you have powdery mildew, it's a problem on potentially the tree, and it had to be treated. Tar spotted maple, well, not so much. It shows up every fall, makes the leaves kind of look funky, but it's not going to kill the tree. And so that's why having, going through and finding a certified arborist that knows these things, or talking and working with the Cooperative Extension Office to help you identify what your problems are, is important. So I've got just a couple of things that I thought I would update you on. You've probably all heard about chestnut disease, chestnut blight. Chestnut used to be a massive tree that no longer exists as a canopy tree, but they're still here because the trees don't die from this fungal disease. There are cankers, the orange stains, it's a genus called Nectaria, the fungus, and it is a problem. It kills the canopy, but they resprout from the roots. So although they're still here and they're part of the diversity of the system, they're never going to be a tree again. That is until we started hybridizing them with Chinese chestnut. And so then there's the whole question about, well, what about hybridization? We no longer have a native genotype. The genes of the North American chestnut are now being fused with or merged with Asian chestnut, hybridizing. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Well, we could get the trees back in the landscape. It's a hybrid, but we now have a different gene pool. Very interesting conversations to have about whether it's something we should be doing or shouldn't be doing. It applies to crop science, it applies to human science, it applies to biology in all different ways. But the reality is that the American chestnut is gone, but we have hybrids out there that are doing pretty well in urban settings. I think it's the Morton Arboretum that's been a leader on that. Dutch elm disease. A lot of people know about Dutch elm disease, caused by beetles, one native, one not native. Came in from, originally this fungal problem came in from Asia, near the Himalayas, in that region of the world. And the one in parentheses, Ophiostoma ulmi, was the original disease that was identified in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And we continued to send wood products, elm products back and forth from North America to Europe. And the fungus then rehybridized with itself, and they renamed it Novo ulmi because it was more virulent. Now that it had back-crossed and hybridized with itself and became an even worse problem than it was before. And so Dutch elm disease is a great example of it's an impossible system to try to beat. The only way that you really can protect an elm tree these days is with a chemical infusion. And I've got a picture of a different disease that is getting a tree injection. But elm is out there, we still have it, it just isn't nearly as common as it used to be. But this is an example of a disease cycle that came in from out of the country and it caused a major problem. It's called Dutch elm disease because it was identified, the pathosystem was identified by researchers in Holland, although the disease originally came from Asia. Pine bark beetles, I talked a little bit about pine diseases, and so here's a picture from out west, and there's this interesting circle right there. And so, yes, this is a huge problem. The number of pine trees that have been lost in the west over the past decade, I don't know if you can put a number on it. Billions and billions of trees have died because of these native beetles. Climate change, drought, stress in the system causes the beetles to do really well. They attack all these trees, they multiply, and they just spread. But there are a few places where the trees continue to hang on, and it's another interesting concept in the science of natural selection. Are these trees in this little circle better capable of tolerating the disease? Is there some genetic component that allowed them to be a little more tolerant of the beetles? Or maybe there's no pine trees there, I don't know. But it does speak to the fact that pine trees aren't going away. Maybe they'll be able to adapt, and this is what has happened throughout eons of life. A planet has constantly changed. systems have been wiped out by disease, by over-foraging. Climate change climate change has been happening for millions and millions of years, just not as fast as it's happening today, caused by us. It's been a much slower process, and because it's happening at such a rapid rate that the plants aren't adapting well. Millennia ago, it was a very slow process over thousands and thousands of years. Here we're doing it in a couple of decades, and plants are being overwhelmed, and it goes to corals as well, and they're not adapting as well as we'd hoped. But all's not lost. There's a chance that some could adapt and be okay. Oh, there's my beetle slide. And that these pine bark beetles live in different parts of the tree is one of the ways that they can be identified. But they're native and they're part of the systems. It's just that they are overwhelming trees because of some type of environmental stress. This is the disease that I worked on for my graduate work. It's called laurel wilt. I'm from Volusia County, and it originally came into the port near Savannah. It was identified in 2002, probably got here a little before that, but nobody really knows how it got here. Certainly it was a wood product. People have conflicting ideas of how it happened. I have my own theories. But it moved and it spread throughout the southeast because people were moving firewood. And I know it's happened here because a guy that I met that brought it into Daytona Beach had a daughter in Jacksonville. He turns wood for a hobby. She had a tree that died, he took some of it, brought it to Daytona Beach, and was turning some beautiful wood, but he released the disease. I mean, it would have gotten here anyway. I mean, he felt really bad for a long time, but once I showed him the medicine, it's not your fault. I mean, yeah, you brought it here 2 years earlier than it would have gotten here, but it was going to get here anyway. It's not your fault. I mean, this has been moved throughout the southeast. Billions of trees have died because of this disease, and almost the entire family of plants in the Lauraceae. So if you cook with bay leaves, that's in this family. Now, the disease hasn't pushed further west than Texas, but it could. Right? All somebody has to do is take a truckload of firewood to California, and then California has a huge problem. This is a tree behind a house in Ormond Beach, near Daytona Beach, and the tree's still partially green. It turned brown in about 5 days and was completely dead in a week. That's how fast this disease in the summertime would affect a tree. Little tiny beetles are misidentifying trees. The males are inconsequential because they don't fly, so the females fly around, they find a tree, they chew on the tree a little bit because that's what they do. They like to bore into trees to reproduce. As the female bores into the tree, goes all the way into the center as close as it can get, she then lays eggs and has progeny, but she's also releasing fungal spores in that little tiny hole that they feed on. And so they're called ambrosia beetles, or food of the gods. And so the fungus grows in these little tiny tunnels, and then the adults, female feeds on the fungus. The juveniles, once they hatch out of eggs, they feed on the fungus. And the fungus, it's like a peanut allergy for somebody. Somebody eats peanuts and has a shock situation. These trees go into shock because they are allergic to the fungus. Nobody knew it. It could never have been predicted, but it's what happened. Here's some trees in Daytona Beach that they're all brown now. They died in about 2 weeks. They were perfectly green. In the back is an oak tree. So they all look like oak trees. The whole thing looked like oak trees. Beautiful canopy, beautiful place to drive by, not far from my house. And then just 6 months later, they cut them all down because they were dead. And now it's changed the entire ecology. Property values changed, well, not entirely, but property values are then, because these trees should have all this canopy, all this shade, all this biodiversity, and so it's done had a huge impact on the ecology of all of the southeast. Now, I mentioned that this disease affects the entire family of the Lauraceae. There's only one plant in there that really didn't seem to be affected in trials when they were exposed to the disease, but here are two in our area. We don't have red bay. The genus Persea doesn't exist here. It is in coastal Georgia. But we have sassafras and we have spicebush. These are all in the Lauraceae, and you wouldn't even know it if your tree died because of this disease. Since they don't cover massive amounts of the landscape, the trees in the coastal areas, it's 15% of the canopy. So when they go, it's obvious. You have a few spotted, sassafras in your landscape, spicebush, probably even a little less. So if one just up and dies, you wouldn't think much about it. But this is what it could be. It's this beetle moving around, chewing on the plants and then killing them. Avocado is also in this family. And so when I was in the lab, we had visitors from Mexico, from the West Coast of the United States. How are you dealing with this disease? What does it look like? What are our solutions? And because avocado is dying, not as fast, but it is dying, and has put pressure on the agricultural industry related to avocado. So it is a huge, huge problem, and it just speaks to the danger of moving firewood and what's happening to the disease, because it's all being spread long distance by us. So we need to be careful about what we move. Part of my graduate work was, yes?
I have a question of moving. What if we're buying from Home Depot a laurel that we want to put in? Are we bringing?
Probably not. So the plant itself
the
would be
nurseries
dead. Yeah, if it had the disease, it would be dead.
Okay.
So they're not going to be carriers.
Would it be not coming from Florida, this crop of the stuff coming up that we're getting rhododendrons put in from Home Depot? What if the supplier has something in the soil?
Yeah, those are all things we don't know. You know, a lot of our garden plants come from Texas. Texas is a massive producer of ornamental plants. And there's another, no, I took it out. They have moved, we move plants around like crazy. So yes, possibly. Yeah, it's not a huge problem, because I think we would know more about it. But we always should be concerned about where we buy things, how they got to us. It's always a risk. Not huge. I wouldn't lose sleep over it. You know, you're buying something from Home Depot or any of the box stores. I wouldn't lose sleep over you're introducing a problem into your landscape. It could happen, but it's something I wouldn't lose sleep over. Yes, sir.
Could a source of moving these pathogens all around be something we use by the thousands every day, and that are used in the ports, and that's wooden shipping pallets?
Yeah, pallets are a big deal, and because of these diseases, it's finally gotten attention of the government that they've started heat treatment processes. So I don't know how far along in the process, but at some point, by now it should be taken effect. Every wood pallet coming in the United States has to have a seal of treatment before it can be brought in. So either heat treated, or they used to be exposing them to methyl-bromide, and that would kill any wood-boring insects. So yeah, there is a mechanism in place that the USDA has worked hard at eliminating pallets as a vector for for coming into wood products. That's what they said. You know, they said wood pallets were the reason why this disease. This is the ambrosia beetle. But I don't believe it. I don't. My work showed me that they didn't like being in dry wood. So I don't think that disease got here through pallets. I think it got here through people who trade in wood. And there's the whole industry, the whole world of people who trade wood, from around the world. I think that's how it got here. Someone got some wood in Asia, and they brought it in, and they were going to take it to a wood collector's thing, and I think that's how it got here. If you buy wood, I thought you were going to ask me, if you buy wood at the store in the packets, that's almost always been heat treated. So don't feel bad about that. The danger is you cutting down a dead tree in your community and taking it to Tennessee to visit relatives, moving a disease that way. So when you buy it at the store, it's been heat treated. It's okay. So I treated all of the hundreds and hundreds of trees with this fungicide. Had to be a pre-treatment. We realized that if the disease was already in the tree, no way to stop it. So I'd find trees that didn't show any signs of the pathogen, treat them, and at best I had 65%. And it was an incredibly expensive endeavor. And time-consuming to treat all of these trees. This tree eventually died. It was a perfect candidate. I thought we're going to save this tree. And I don't know, 6 months later, it still died. It's a very difficult thing to manage disease. We just need to stop moving stuff around in the first place. So I think I'm doing time here. I can talk about plants all day. It's a spotted lanternfly, new problem, has come into mostly Pennsylvania, but it's in Virginia, and we've got New Jersey there. So it's, there's a picture of it. You brought in unintentionally. It's a beautiful little moth. However, it chews on a huge number of plants and causes ornamental damage. I don't think it's a damage to the agriculture industry, but it's a damage to our forest systems and to our ornamental world. And they live as their stages, these little spotted nymphs, and they're problematic. So if you see anything like that, you want to squish it. Let the capture it if you could, because the Department of Agriculture would want to know and have to see a sample. But capture one and kill the rest. But you know, the danger is, that's what its feeding damage looks like. The danger is that there could be something that looks like it.
Yeah.
So there's the spotted lanternfly on the left and a couple of mimics. This is the one that looks like closest, most like it. So, you know, contact the Cooperative Extension Office, the Division of Forestry, somebody if you think you find something a bit odd. Take a photo of it, send it to somebody, and then, you know, we just want to track it. And so there are a few like this I've got that are problematic. Oak trees are so important. You know, they're across our landscape. They are the dominant. I mean, it used to be chestnut and elm. Today, oak is the dominant tree. And in Florida, we're seeing diebacks in the mid-2000s about, you know, all over the place about trees dying. And there was I think I took it out. There was a canker that is, the fungus is entering the trees mostly through where wasps, you know, so oak trees get wasp galls. A wasp, you know, injects a hormone, creates a little ball on the tree. She lays her eggs in there, and those are wasp galls. And they're really non-problematic for trees, but the fungus was gaining entry through these wounds that the wasps were making and causing these problems. And it was being confounded by the fact that the chemical companies were using compounds on the grass to keep the grass alive, you know, a weed and feed thing, and it's called methylfuran methyl. And a researcher, the Forest Pathology Lab at the University of Florida, did a test and was able to demonstrate empirically that, look, you putting this compound on the grass to remove weeds is killing trees, and we got to figure out a way to get around it. And so there was a lot of pushback from the university, the donors that give the university a lot of money, that are involved in landscape ornamentals and turf grass, pushback on, you know, what this meant in the big picture. But it's getting some traction, and you know, trying to find ways to not use these weed and feeds, herbicides around trees because they were certainly killing them. Oak wilt is a disease that is, you know, people say my oak isn't doing well, I've got oak wilt. Well, we don't have oak wilt in our area. I'll show you that in a moment. But it is a problem because it moves by beetles, native beetles. It's a fungus that is transmitted from tree to tree, underground via the roots. The roots contact with each other, and then the fungus can move from one tree to another tree. And it is a huge problem. It is all over the country. It came into Wisconsin in 1944 or so, and this is where it's been documented. And it's a pathogen. I mean, trees either, so there are groups of trees. There are white oaks, red oaks, and these kind of in-between oaks. And it's really bad on the red oaks. It kills them quick. The white oaks tolerate pretty good, but it has to be properly identified. Trees have to be chemically treated. They've got to be isolated by cutting around the roots, so the roots, you know, are being trimmed underground so they can't cross. But it is a big deal, and again, moved around by wood products. Because if you've got one of these little beetles in the wood, you're moving wood from an infected area to another area, it's, you know, it increases the chance of transmission. Walnut, how many people have walnut, love walnut? There's a walnut disease that started out west and has come across the country. So that's what it looks like on a feeding hole by a little beetle. There's the beetle there, bores a hole, kills the tissue, dies because of the fungus, and girdles the twigs, parts of the canopy begin to die, and then you have a dead walnut tree. And it's unfortunate because walnut is native in the green areas. This is the extent of walnut. The orange is where walnut is used as an ornamental tree out west. I was in Denver when I was at a conference and we were learning about this. And so they use it out west as an ornamental tree, and it's dying. The trees are dying because of this disease complex. But the eastern range and across the Midwest plains, the fungus doesn't do well, and the beetle doesn't do well, and so there's been kind of a barrier, a natural barrier. But people started moving, guess what? Firewood. And it's came in, the disease has been identified in Tennessee and Virginia and Pennsylvania. It's not here yet, but it certainly could be. So keep an eye on your walnuts. Yes, ma'am?
Black walnuts?
Black walnut.
Okay.
Any of the juglin species are susceptible to this disease. There really isn't a treatment known. So the best thing to do is, you know, find the tree. If you've got large patches of the canopy dead, you know, hire a tree company, get that cut out, call the Division of Forestry and say, do you want to come take a section of the tree, send it to the pathology lab, see if you can culture this fungus and see if we've identified this walnut disease. So, you know, we live in a world where there's so many trees here, it's hard to see dead trees in our landscape. But keep looking. You know, being an observant caretaker of your land is important. So the next one is emerald ash borer. This kills ash, and it came into around 2002, the same time as the disease I studied, into Michigan. And they tried creating hot spots and cutting down all of the ash around these areas where they had a known infection of this little beetle. I've got a picture of it in a moment, and it didn't work. You know, people moving firewood, the disease, the beetles can fly, and moving beyond this, I can't remember what the radius of where they removed, they quarantined, they cut them all, they cut every tree down, trying to isolate and stop this disease, and they couldn't do it. The beetle flies, people move wood without telling people, and it became a problem. So here's the extent. So 2002 was in Michigan, first identified, but here it is today. 20 years later, and this is how far this insect has spread. It's been identified in our area. It's just a problem. But the key thing about identifying this disease is the D-shaped hole that this little thing makes. This little beetle makes a D-shaped hole, and that's how you can tell whether the tree died due to this disease or something else. That's how big it is. Well, that's not really big it is. It's really quite it's quite small. But it's a metallic green beetle. It's pretty unique looking, but they don't spend a lot of time outside the tree, so it's hard to see them. But that's what it is. I think I've got 3 more. This is the Asian longhorn beetle. Huge problem in the Northeast, and this one, we might be able to beat. It doesn't have a very fast reproductive cycle. It's big and easy to see, and if you cut down a tree and then put it through a tree tripper, then the tree is going to, the beetles inside the tree are going to die. So it's manageable, and they're doing a good job in Central Park, New York City, at keeping this thing at bay. So constant pressure, constant support, funding the people to go out and be surveying for it is an important aspect of managing this. This thing is really big. I bet, well, there's right there. It's huge. It's like that big when the antennas are stretched out. Wow. Huge beetle. But they don't bite, they don't bother anybody. They just chew on about 30 different species of trees.
They love maples in the Northeast.
Yes.
And
so
the
many
maple industry quite concerned.
The blue is no locations. The red are suspects where they've been captured, but not established. So, but this map is a little more concerning because it shows us where they could exist. So that they modeled where the tree species are across the country, and what's their likelihood of having forest systems that are conducive to supporting the Asian longhorn beetle. So the wood system, the forest system, we have the right species for it to do well here. So again, be vigilant. Look at your trees, get to know them. And then the hemlock adept, we live here, we live with this disease. It's been here for a century, and it's tragic what it's done. The size of the trees that these little tiny insects have eventually over time killed. It's a very chronic thing where they inject toxins into the tree, and it eventually degrades the needles, kills the needles fall off, and then the tree runs out of carbohydrate resources and can no longer survive. So the hemlock woolly adelgid is an insidious little thing, Asian. Again, nobody knows exactly how it got here, but it is a problem across the entire eastern seaboard. It has a really weird life cycle in that you'll see it if you turn over the leaf of the branch of a hemlock, and you can see the white masses of the adelgid. It's kind of like an aphid relative, but there are so many of them, it's not really feasible to scrape them all off. Chemical treatments do work, but the insidious nature of it is that they go through these overlapping life cycles, and these little black spots are one of the phases that come out in the spring. So they're starting to do this now, where they emerge from eggs, they've overwintered as an egg, they pupated into different larval stages, and now they're starting to crawl around, and they're looking to find themselves in a bed at the base of a leaf or a needle, and insert themselves, and they stay there for essentially the rest of their lives. And so it's got this really crazy overlapping life cycle. They're all asexual. There's no sexual reproduction going on, but they're just overwhelming because it's easy for a female to make, just to clone itself. And she lays an egg, but it's an unfertilized egg that still develops. It develops into another little young adult. So I've been treating the hemlocks on my property, and I haven't been here long enough to see a huge result, but if you have them, this is the only way to save them is through chemical applications. They are working at biocontrols, releasing wasps or something like that would parasitize them, and that has a lot of promise, but it just has issues. This is the last, yes, ma'am.
Well, I took the Master Naturalist. There's a guy here that teaches, that's studying this woolly
Yeah,
culture.
that's Dr.
And he's
Arnold,
got-
maybe?
Yeah,
Yeah,
Paul.
and he's got 2 beetles. He said he used to have 3 beetles. He's looking for a 3rd beetle. But they've released 2 of the beetles, and they seem to be having some.
Anything to get out there and start eating these organisms just to slow them down is key. I mean, we're never going to get rid of the disease, but if you can put pressure on the insect and the insect populations are reduced, then tree incidence and tree death will be reduced as well. So the last disease I'm going to talk about is this is the Floridachoria. This is the first picture I started with. Its range is incredibly small along the Apalachicola River Basin, and it used to be a pretty large tree and beautiful, but it has been in decline for decades and decades. Nobody really had been watching it that close because it's rare, it's uncommon, it's not something that people spend a lot of time with. But seeing that this tree was losing its large stature and the seedlings were not coming up, there were no medium-sized trees in the environment. They were either really small, coming from seeds, or they were surviving as big ones, but they really were under pressure and were on a steep downward trajectory to eventually go extinct. And so this is what the disease looked like. They're cankers again, and that get in through either the breathing pores, the gas exchange pores called lenticels, or they end up through a wound, and so the back of this towards the plant is dead and the tips are still green, but they will eventually die. Someone in the Forest Service mentioned, in the 80s I think it was, that it's climate change, right? Changing climate is causing problems for this plant. No data. This person just kind of made this observation with no correlating information. Seemed logical that he made the statement. People are like, okay, that sounds all right. So he was advocating the movement of this plant to further north so that it would survive. It's called assisted migration. But the danger with assisted migration is, and the guy that I studied with fought with this group called the Guardians of the Toria, something like that, to not do that, because if they were moving around the pathogen, so they needed the pathogens. So they were moving the pathogen to other places that could have a larger effect, that could affect other species beyond Toria. And so I think they finally recognized, look, this guy has studied it, he identified this new pathogen, and so now they've changed their tune and they're trying to now grow them in greenhouses and then move them once they're known to be, certified to be disease-free. And that's reasonable. A reasonable way to help ensure the survival of the species. But then this notion of assisted migration, simply because we want to do something, has ramifications. And it is bigger than us. And so we need to work with researchers, work with universities, and make sure that when we are moving plants, we're moving non-diseased plants so that we're not making the disease problem worse. And so this is the segue into the last part of the talk where I decided to stick this in the last minute because I heard a podcast. There's a podcast called In Defense of Plants, which is great. In Defense of Plants. This guy, Matt, interviews really interesting people, do all sorts of things. And so I happen to catch, well, I don't catch them, I download them. Right? Different way of thinking about technology these days. So I download the podcast of this talk. There's a woman, Westwood is her name. Murphy Westwood, right? I recommend Murphy. So she is out of the Morton Arboretum and was part of a team that tried to quantify tree diversity globally. And it was a really amazing paper, the things they did. And so what I did is I thought, well, let's summarize this with a group and talk about just kind of, the big nuggets. And so this is an amazing study. And so they found like 60,000 plants, a little less, 59,000 something, tree species globally. Unfortunately, lots of them are under threat. In the continental U.S., so it's excluding Hawaii and Alaska and all the islands, Puerto, Guam, And so we have 881 species from 269 genera in continental North America, United States, with the two largest groups being the oaks and the hawthorns, Crataegus. And at least in, so they didn't go find these things in the woods. A lot of it was herbarium specimens. This speaks to the importance of what an herbarium is. Places where they go press plants, they put them in a locker, and save them for people to review in the future. And so they're often unappreciated, and universities often get rid of them because they take up space and all that stuff. But they use herbarium specimens to make a lot of these determinations about what was found out there. And Crataegus is one that shows up a lot in herbarium specimens, but you don't find them so much in the landscape. Kind of a conundrum there. So we got a lot of 881 species in North America. 165 are listed as threatened. 11 to 16% are threatened with extinctions. This is like the Florida Torreya. So that's a kind of a large percentage of 881 that are under threat due to climate change, due to disease, due to invasive species. A lot of factors that warrant more investigation. But there's just a finite amount of money. And then for Georgia, so I went and so if you're a data person, I was able to get the Excel sheet with all the species. So I've got my email at the end. If you want to email me, I can email you this spreadsheet if you wanted to look and play around with it. But I went through and I pulled out, these are endemic, meaning found nowhere else but in Georgia, and they're called these Crataegus that are probably only herbarium specimens, nobody really knows. So, because it's such an odd group. But these were found, identified through the herbarium or in person as only occurring in Georgia. So 30% of the trees are at risk, and they're at risk for agriculture. That's kind of the way it is. We need food. Logging for timber, because we got to clear land to grow stands of timber, livestock, urbanization. So there are a lot of threats putting pressure on our forest systems. But we know how important forests are for sequestering carbon and trying to help with our whole global climate change issue. Not all trees are created equal when it comes to sequestering carbon. I mean, long-lived trees are the key. Anything that lives for a century is a great candidate for growing to sequester carbon. If they're talking about something like sycamore, which grows pretty fast and then dies pretty fast, not a good candidate for being considered a carbon sequestration species because they're not holding on to carbon for long enough. Some other numbers, I have some more numbers, nobody wants to look at numbers. But again, I think on the left side are all the genera, all the species, the highest ranking species of oak, the Crataegus, the hawthorns, willows, pines, the prunus, which are the cherry group, ilex are the hollies, ashes, junipers, and so those are the highest number of trees they were finding. And so that's a whole other thing, is how they were defining a tree was an interesting thing to read in the paper. What fell in as a tree and what didn't was not as easy as you would think. They debated it a lot. Here are the states with the highest amount of tree diversity. Florida, I think, nudged out Texas by a couple of species. But to the south, right? So it kind of reinforces the notion that further south you are on the planet, the warmer it is, the more water, the more diversity that occurs, which is a truism that occurs across the globe. And that's that. So, any questions? So here's my email, my personal email. If you wanted to email something, you had a question or something, I'm happy to answer questions, to give you advice, and whatever it might be. Any questions? All right. I played with landscape design a little bit. I was hired by this company to specialize in native plants in Florida, and so for them I do some designs occasionally. I don't really do it inside, but I was willing to work with Jonathan. He and I talked once about trying to do some designs for the hillside he was talking about. He needed a plan with it, kind of with a electronically drawn, that I was going to be able to help him with that. So yeah, there's the opportunity where I can probably help people with that. Yes, ma'am.
What kind of native trees would you recommend for planting around the household that stay within their allotted size and maybe not be susceptible to some of these things we know about?
I don't think you should worry right off the top about like walnut. So walnut's a great tree, But the downside of walnut, you've got these big walnuts that be falling on your house. So in choosing the right, in Florida, so I'm new to Georgia, but the idea in Florida that the power companies came up with is right plant, right place. That the University of Florida came up with, worked with the Native Plant Society, the state was involved, and so they've really pushed this notion of right plant, right place. And so there isn't just one answer. You know, oaks are great because they don't produce, the acorns generally aren't big enough to cause problems, but then you've got to look about roots. You know, if I put it in place, you know, am I going to have future root conflicts with sidewalks or sewer systems or electrical lines? So you do need to find, I don't think there's not an easy answer. Do you want shade? Do you want to keep it low with like a red bud? Red buds are great, you know, they kind of get kind of big, but they don't, and lots of shade in the summertime, but I know it's not an easy answer to give you, yes.
I have a comment about walnuts. Are they not, they release something into the soil. You're not supposed to put them in some places like next to gardens and
Yeah, I
they
think
will
that's-
poison other plantings. Just be aware of that about black walnuts.
That has been, you know, the really good research on that is inconclusive.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Oh,
I mean,
okay.
people say it, it's really, less observational.
It turns it more acidic.
Yeah, it does change the pH, but it's not, it's called allelopathy, where a plant will do something and exclude other plants. You know, all the research, the papers I've read, the research is like, you know, maybe there's a little bit of an effect, but not as big as what.
Okay, I always thought that was a thing.
Yeah, well, people talk about it and
Okay.
say it's a thing, and people, it's, you know, so I wouldn't worry about it that much.
Okay.
The shade is a bigger problem than the chemicals, because they don't allow sunlight to get there.
What are some of the longest lived trees here?
In Georgia, well, in the Appalachians, I think the longest lived trees are probably the oaks today. Walnuts, they can live quite a long time too. I would have put hemlocks on that list, but the insect has degraded them. But I think like white oak is one of the longest lived trees that we have these days. Globally, the longest lived trees are the sequoias out west, the mountain redwoods, and then there's the coastal redwoods. The oldest one on the planet is in the deserts of northern New Mexico. They call it the Methuselah tree.
Yeah. It's a cedar, is it?
It is, cedar or pine, I think it's a pine.
Bristlecone?
Bristlecone pine, there we go, it's a bristlecone pine, that's the oldest tree known for sure. There's some other, in the Middle East, they've identified some trees that they've said were the oldest, but this one has been, I think, identified with certainty to be 6,000 years old, more or less.
I have mostly concern, I'm worried about after listening to the live oak, like Angel Oak, are groups like you always monitoring those live oaks in Florida? And then I had so many questions for you. One other thing, the impact of what you're talking about, you can see it at Joyce Kilmer National Forest. If you walk through there, it's changed just in 10 years. Other thing is, drove by downtown here in Blairsville, and they have cut every branch. There's a big oak. They kept every branch tip.
Yes, I saw that, it's on the other side of the square.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
that does impact, I mean, where does it go? It hurts the tree, doesn't it?
That tree probably won't die, but they've introduced wounds into the tree
Yeah.
that will eventually allow fungi to enter, and those will eventually rot. That tree will, so this is 2003, I would be able to wager that within 10 years, I mean, that tree should live hundreds of years, it'll be
Yeah.
gone in 10 years.
That's what I saw. I saw that in Marietta, they would cap the trees,
Yeah.
and then with, things start to die.
Yeah, and that's why it's important to, I think, to look for, if you're hiring a tree company, and nobody around here really does, and I've realized, is ask them if they are certified arborists through the International Society of Arboriculture. That's what my degree is through, my certification's through. Because there's a set of standards that through research, they've been able to identify what's good to do and what's not good to do, which is that tree on the, what's that?
It's
The east side and south side of town?
Yeah, going towards Cleveland.
That's not a good thing to do.
It's horrible.
So, but there's not many people around. I've kind of looked at, called a few places, just kind of testing the waters, and it's not really available. The reason they do that, I think it's okay, is in Europe. If you've ever gone to
Yeah.
Italy or Spain, they will, like crepe myrtles, they will push them back to nubs every year. And so it's a horticultural technique that allows the trees to live for really long periods of time if it's done correctly. But they don't do it right with crepe myrtles, and so it ends up becoming a problem and they die. But in Europe, they've been working on this science of this type of pruning for centuries. And so it works. They know what they're doing, the trees die, they do it the right way, and it's called pollarding, is that type of trimming. And people try to do it here, but they don't know what they're doing, and they end up killing the trees or causing problems. Yes?
What can you tell me about buckeyes?
What do you want to know about? I know a little bit about buckeye. Wonderful little things.
I just have buckeyes in my yard. How long do they live? I know I've got two different varieties. One drops the leaves before the buckeyes, and one drops the buckeyes before the leaves.
Well, that's the genus Aesculus. There are a couple of species within that group, and so you may have just two different species that are in
I think so, yes,
Yeah.
because I know that one of them came from the big buckeye tree in Sotheby's Cove, which I think is the second largest buckeye tree in the United States. And I wonder how long they live. How long do buckeyes live?
I don't know off the top of my head. We could look it up. A long time. I think they're relatively long, many decades. I think they've got that potential. A lot of trees here where it's colder will live longer because they are not growing as rapidly as in Florida. There isn't really a dormant season in Florida, so leaves will shed their leaves and then put them right back out. And some species grow so fast, they've got this accelerated growth where they grow fast for a short period of time and then die. But in the north, we're northern, it's a slower process because they've got to slow down every winter, drop their leaves, and then start over again. And so they tend to live longer here if they're hardwood trees. So I think buckeyes live for a pretty long time. I don't have a number.
Well, that buckeye in Sotheby's Cove has got to be really old. I mean, it required my dad and two kids to reach around it when I was a kid.
Wow.
So that was like, 60 years ago.
Yeah,
That was a huge
I grew up
tree.
with buckeyes in Florida, and they get to be like that. So I have a whole new thing to learn here about.
And then they're kind of a nuisance because they pop up all over the place.
Yeah. So I don't know, because I'm new to the appellations, is that root suckers coming up, or are they just really successful at germinating seeds?
No, it's the buckeye that falls off the tree. I mean, if you get them early enough, you see the buckeye sprout, it's still there.
Yeah.
You see the roots and the,
That's a yellow.
Oh, nice.
That's a yellow buckeye in Sesame Cove.
is it? So you know that buckeye tree?
Well, that's what I was told.
Well, I was actually in Alaska and found this article about big trees. And there was that tree that I knew from my childhood, and it said it was the second largest buckeye tree in the U.S.
Yeah, big trees are a wonderful thing. Well, so you got the email? I'm no longer in it. I spent most of my life in education, but it didn't pay very well. I'm now doing something else that pays a little better, but I still love to share and talk about plants all the time. So feel free to contact.
Thank you.
Thank you.